Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and this is my life as a landlord. I'm so pleased you are educating yourself about your landlord journey. Today, we're exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for Canadian province Prince Edward Island. In all of my location-specific episodes, I've included hyperlinks to the province in this case, so Prince Edward Island Residential Tenancy Act, plus all the other resources I could find for that province. We're going to go through that today. Each of my location-specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way, answering the same four questions. So the first one we answer is, what are the basics of the Residential Tenancy Act of PEI in this case? The second thing is, what are the nuances? What's different? What stands out? What's not there? Excuse me. The third thing, some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in PEI. And the fourth thing, where to get help in the local area of PEI. Like, where do you even start? If you just are lost, what do you do? So those are my four main points that I'm going to go through. And this is the same thing I do for every single location specific podcast. And then at the very end of the episode, I'll go through what I call my bingo card, which is the list of my most standard items that I see when I do these location specific episodes. Now, if you're a frequent flyer of my life as a landlord, you will notice that my bingo card has evolved over the years because the more I see and the more specific and the details that I see in all these different locations, I add them to the bingo card because it makes more sense. And so I've actually done an upgrade. You're going to notice that in this tranche. I'll review what's there for PEI and what's missing and what's extra, what stands out, especially since I do quite a bunch of these. Now, I have to at least give my disclaimer. My big asterisk here is that there are more guiding documents. There may be more things that apply to you and your rentals that are in PEI. So you've got to do your own research. This will get you started, but this is not the end all be all, because while this may be perfect and it may be great and exactly right at the time of recording, 10 minutes later, it could change. So you've still got to keep up, but this will at least get you started. If you're finding this in the library at My Life as a Landlord, you will see it actually just is a reference, which is great, but you've got to do your own research as well. I got to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you want to know more about real estate investing or you're curious of what Mike and I are up to, check out alohajv.com. Okay, so we're going to jump into the four tenants here, the four basics of the PEI Residential Tenancy Act. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And if you're watching on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord, that's probably the best thing to do because you'll be able to go right along with me as I'm scrolling around these documents. Now, across the top here, I've got all 6 of the hyperlinks already. Now, these are in the show notes. You can follow along right with me. If I find something else that's really interesting while we're recording, I'll put it in the show notes. So you'll have the whole thing. So the PEI Residential Tenancy Act, you'll notice it's 66 pages long. That can be a little long, but that's okay. Remember, this is a law. So this is an actual legal law. This one I think it's actually not too bad. It's not too legalese, but usually there's like a workbook or a guide that goes with the law part. This one's sort of the whole thing in one. So that's kind of interesting, but that's okay. So I'm just going to go through the table of contents here. This goes into, I'm going to jump to this definitions, and they're in alphabetical order, which I know doesn't seem like a big deal, but sometimes you get into the glossaries and they're not in alphabetical order, which is difficult. So it defines what a landlord is, mobile home park, rent, rental unit, security deposit, all of that. Let's see. It also talks about pets, service animals, a pet, a service animal. In fact, does it define pet? This is interesting. It doesn't define a pet. I've defined a pet in my episodes though, so that's good. Service animal, service or facility, spouse, subtenant. Okay, so this one has got something interesting because it says the act applies to tenancy agreement with a minor. So even though that someone that wants to rent, let's say you've got someone in their teens that is able to rent on their own, usually with assistance of some kind, they may enter into a tenancy agreement. And I personally have rent to plenty of people who are not 18 yet, which is amazing to me that they are mature enough to actually do this. And it's always a concern, right? You always want to make sure. But this is really interesting. I've never seen this called out before. In fact, I'm going to make a note because I'll put this in the summary PEI applies to minors. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So who this act does not apply to, and it goes through a bunch of different exemptions, like a bunch. So I'm going to keep going. You can't put something in the lease that sidesteps the act. That doesn't work either. And then it talks about administration stuff. I'm not going to go into this. Rights and obligations. It talks about renewals of tenancy agreements, application. Landlord shall prepare a written tenancy agreement with respect to tenancy. So you've got to have it in writing. This is interesting because there's some places that say it's okay to have an oral agreement, basically a handshake agreement, but that never works out because it's always ends up being a he said, she said, and nobody's got anything written down. And so, or it's a barrage of texts, right? So just better to have it in writing, which is the best. Formal requirements for the landlord. There's actually quite a bit of in here. Provisions, correct legal name of the landlord, address of the rental unit, date of the tenancy agreement. All this is pretty standard. Address for service, telephone number of the landlord or the landlord's agent and the tenant. Services and facilities included in the rent. Basically, what's, the utilities, is the landscaping and or lawn mowing included, snow removal included, that kind of stuff. The amount of rent that is charged and services and facilities provided. And oh, this is interesting. The amount of rent that was charged and the services and facilities that were provided to the previous tenant of the rental unit, unless there was no previous rental unit. Interesting. You've got to disclose what the previous tenant paid. Okay, that's okay. I've just never seen that before. So that is very interesting. Name and contact information of any person that the tenant is to contact for emergency repairs. That's the landlord's agent. And the agreed terms in respect of the date of when the tenancy starts. What is the periodic? What's the frequency of it? Whether it's weekly, monthly, a year, whatever it is, how long it is. If the tenancy is fixed term, date on which the term ends, rent payable amount, the day that rent is due, which I always say it's the first. Well, it doesn't have to be the first. The frequency of payment and the amount of security deposit and the date the security deposit must be paid. Within 10 days, the landlord and tenant enter a tenancy agreement. The landlord shall give the tenant a copy of the tenancy agreement. That's very standard, is the landlord must furnish the copy to the tenant. I always log that too. 10 days is pretty quick. In British Columbia, it's 21, but still, regardless, you still have to provide it as a landlord. Okay, let's see. There's a new landlord cost. Fees prohibited. Here we go. So some of this stuff is on the bingo list, or the bingo card, which is fine. That's the whole idea. Fees prohibited. A landlord shall not charge a person a fee for accepting an application for a tenancy, processing the application, investigating the applicant's sustainability, suitability as a tenant, or accepting the person as a tenant. Okay, so they don't want basically they don't want the tenant paying any money at all, which I'll be honest, that is pretty standard across Canada. Sometimes they can pay for a criminal record check or a background check of some kind, but I forget which provinces are like that. But PEI is definitely not. So landlords have to make the investment. If you're going to check credit, you're going to check background, do a criminal record check. If any of that costs money, which a credit check does cost money, the landlord has to provide that, which is fine. Okay. The landlord may require a security deposit. Yep. And I'm just trying to think. The security deposit is not an asset of the landlord, but is held by the landlord in trust and shall be used, retained, or dispersed only as provided in the act. Okay, that's the same. So it can't be a working bank account is what that means. I mean, so in fact, it actually tells you more information about where you've got to keep your security deposit. Some places they want it in a specific location, doing specific things like earning interest or whatever. Let's see what it says about limits on the security deposit. And there's actually a bunch more details on the security deposit. I'm not going to read them all because that's going to get really old really quick. Okay, a landlord shall not require or accept a security deposit as greater than, in the case of a tenancy agreement where rent is paid weekly, the equivalent of 1 week's rent, or in any other case, the equivalent of 1 month's rent. Okay, well, that's the answer, is it's 1 month's rent. The tenant may deduct overpayment of security deposit. So if a landlord accepts a security deposit that's greater than 1 month's rent, then they might deduct it. Okay. Overpayment of rent, deemed security. Okay, fine. Receipt. Interest-bearing account. So this is interesting. Within 2 banking days of receipt of a security deposit, the landlord shall deposit it in an interest-bearing account located in the province at a financial institution authorized to accept deposits. Okay, so they must have it in a financial institution, so either bank or credit union in the province of PEI. And then this is even crazier, trust account where a landlord has 3 or more rental units, meaning it's basically a business. It's a legit business where a business landlord has 3 or more rental units. The interest bearing account referred to in the last section shall be a trust account used exclusively for security deposits. Okay. Okay. I'll get it. I'll buy that. And of course, there's got to be an interest rate. You've got to pay the tenant an interest amount. It's usually something very small. And terms respecting service animal. A term in a tenancy agreement that has the effect of prohibiting the presence of service animals is void. Yeah, you can't do that. I liken a service animal as someone of having a prosthetic leg. Like you wouldn't deny somebody because they have a prosthetic leg, just like you wouldn't deny someone that has a service animal. A service animal is actually doing a job that is enabling someone to have a high quality of life, higher quality of life. So you got to be really careful when you're talking about service animals and pets, especially in a no pet building. There is always going to be tension about this because people say, well, I don't want a service animal. I don't want a German Shepherd who's maybe a seeing eye dog or whatever kind of dog it is, or whatever animal it is that is doing a job. I don't want that animal in my building. Okay, well, that's called discrimination. You got to be very careful doing that. You cannot do that. You've got to have your service animals, they do a job. That's the answer. Okay, acceleration term prohibited. Okay, so what this means is that if the tenant signs, let's say they sign a 1 year lease, and 6 months through or sometime before the end of the 1 year, the tenant comes to you and says, I have to break my lease because whatever reason, then what an acceleration clause means is the rest of the rent for that year is due and payable from that tenant. The answer is no, you don't do that. There's quite a few places where there is not an acceleration term permitted. You don't do that. And so they basically can break the lease. Now you can charge them. There is a fee for that, but you cannot demand the rent for the remainder of the lease period, if that makes sense. Okay, so start of tenancy, conduct an inspection report, copy to the tenant. We've talked about that. Tenant's got to pay rent when it's due. Absolutely. A landlord shall provide a tenant with a receipt for rent paid in cash. Now, here's the trick. I accept cash, but to pay cash for rent, you've got to go to where we bank, and we have a special bank account for people who want to pay in cash. And so there's actually a protocol of exactly how they pay in cash, and their deposit slip from the bank is their receipt for paying rent in cash. And we say, put in the memo, put your name and your unit number in the memo, and that's how we do it. So we actually offer 3 methods to pay rent. So they can walk into the bank and put it right into the bank account, whether they're paying with a check or they're paying with cash, either one. Then I actually have, through my local credit union, I've actually worked out that I can accept auto debit. Now that's not everywhere. That one is in Canada specifically. I have not found an auto debit in the States, but there is ways that you can do like an ACH. I've heard apartments.com does something like this. You register as a landlord and you can do an automatic. But the other thing that we do is we accept e-transfers. E-transfers are in Canada, and then we can also do a Venmo in the US or Zelle in the US. So we do both of those. But rent is due on or before midnight on the 1st. It's pretty simple. So saying that a landlord shall provide a receipt for rent paid in cash when they walk into the bank, that's their receipt. So notice that in all 3 of my methods of paying rent, I don't collect rent. I don't send people to collect rent. It's the tenant's responsibility to pay the rent on or before midnight on the 1st. It's the same thing, right? Okay. Okay. You still no application prohibited fees during tenancy. Okay, so a landlord cannot charge a guest fee whether or not the guest stays overnight. You cannot charge a fee for replacement keys or access devices if the replacement is required because the landlord changed the locks. So, but if the tenant locks themselves out or the tenant, yeah, lost their keys, then they can pay for it. A fee in real you cannot landlord cannot charge a fee in relation to any cost incurred by the landlord to repay the security deposit or for a fee prescribed in regulations. Okay, fair enough. So, but a landlord may charge a fee in PEI for the actual cost of replacing keys, that's true, or any other devices, actual cost of additional keys or other access devices by the tenant, like a fob or a garage clicker or something. Yeah. The landlord may charge a fee for a financial institution return of a tenant's check, like an NSF fee, or an administrative fee of not more than $25 for the return of a tenant's check. Fee for services or facilities requested by the tenant if those services or facilities are not required to be provided. So things like a freezer, if somebody wanted a freezer, or an air conditioner, like a wall-mounted air or a wall air conditioner, then we actually offer that and say, look, you have to pay extra for that. And then it says the service provided in regulations. Okay, so terminating or restricted facilities. So a landlord shall not terminate or restrict service or facility if the service or facility is reasonably related to the tenant's use and enjoyment of the rental unit as a living accommodation, or it's a term of the tenancy agreement. Basically, if you agree to do it, you have to provide it. You can't not provide it. But you may, as a landlord, terminate or restrict certain services in PEI if, let's see, the landlord gives 1 month notice in the approved form of the termination of such, so whatever that service or facility, and you have to reduce the rent in the amount equivalent of that value. That makes sense. Tenant's right to quiet enjoyment, that's pretty standard. Landlord's right to enter the rental unit is restricted. This is called abusive access, and so this is going to talk about how much time a landlord has to give notice, proper notice, what it's all involved, why you have to go in. This is because there's been way too many landlords in the past that just barge right into their tenants' units for really no reason and won't leave them alone, right? So come on, do the right thing. So proper notice, written notice to the tenant at least 24 hours before the time of entry. You've got to have a legit reason why you're going in. Carry out a rental or repair or replacement. Allow for potential mortgagee, insurer, or appraiser of the residential property to view the unit or carry out an inspection. Yeah. And then there's several others. If the tenant has abandoned the rental unit, you've got to give proper notice and go in. If an emergency exists and entry is necessary to protect health, safety, and welfare of people or to avert or limit property damage, you go right in, right? I tell people if you're calling 911, I'm coming in. Like that's the way it is. Landlord requires access to the rental unit to show a prospective tenant. These are all pretty reasonable and pretty standard. Entry hours must be between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. Can't be at 3 in the morning, right? They've got to be standard hours, some kind of standard hours. A landlord, so a tenant has to provide access to the landlord. You can't restrict access or the common areas of the residential property by the tenant or a person permitted in the rental unit. So this happens all the time. I'm on lots of social media channels or groups about landlording, and they're saying, look, I'm trying to sell my house or I'm trying to rent the unit. The tenant's already given notice, or there's an eviction involved, right? Like there's an eviction going on because the tenant is being really confrontational and they can't show the unit because it's frustrated. It's a frustrated tenancy. And the tenant is basically just being combative. And so you can't do that, but it's tough. It's, it's very confrontational. It's very stressful. It can be right in your face. I've done it. I'm doing it now. I'm actually in the middle of an eviction right now. Not fun. Okay, tenants shall not interfere with the quiet enjoyment of other tenants. This talks about access and doors, repair and maintenance. Landlord, don't be a slumlord. You've got to make sure everything complies with health, safety, and housing standards. And tenant's knowledge of non-repair irrelevant. Okay. So tenant's knowledge of non-repair irrelevant. This is interesting. I don't know what that means. For greater certainty, subsection 1 applies despite the, okay, wait a minute. Landlord should maintain residential property in a state of repair. Knowledge of non-repair. Okay, I don't understand. That's a little bit confusing. I don't get it. Tenants responsible for ordinary cleanliness. Oh, I like that. Ordinary cleanliness. That's going on my list. Ordinary cleanliness. Um, Ordinary cleanliness of the rental unit in all areas of the residential property used exclusively by the tenant, except to the extent that the tenancy agreement expressly requires that the landlord to clean it. That's fine. Proper sorting and disposition of garbage or waste, compostable materials, and recyclable materials of the tenant and any other person permitted in the rental unit by the tenant in accordance with applicable requirements. Basically, you've got to keep up the unit. You can't be full of trash or garbage, rodents. You cannot do that. And this is exactly why we do periodic inspections. And I do call my tenants out on it. Especially, I'm sorry to tell you, the older single males are usually the worst offenders. They have no problem living in filth. I have a problem with it. If I can't see the floor because of the garbage or there's rat droppings or whatever it is, I don't even know what it is. But I mean, I have exterminator, but they still have to clean it up. So I don't know if they even see it, but typically they're the worst offenders. So they're not the only offenders, but they're typically the worst. Okay, tenant responsible for undue damage. This is what we call willful damage, where it's more than just normal wear and tear. This defines emergency repairs. And there's all kinds of examples. That's cool. And the tenant, okay, notice by tenant. A tenant of a rental unit shall provide notice as soon as practicable to the landlord or contact person referred to in subsection 3 when emergency repairs are needed to the rental unit. Basically, if something is an emergency, like fire, flooding, water, smoke, whatever it is, you need to get a hold of somebody, they need to get a hold of somebody. And if they can't get a hold of somebody, they're welcome to call a plumber or electrician, whatever they got to do to keep everything safe. Because the last thing we want to do is cause damage and then displace the tenant because of said damage. That's no good. Landlord has to provide a contact person for the repairs, and the tenant may take action if the landlord just isn't dealing with it. So that's part of hope. Do not be a slumlord. Like, be mindful. If it's a safety issue, that's your deal. That's a landlord issue. Okay, here we go. Getting into assigning or subletting a rental unit. And for those of you who are listening, we're on page 21 of 66. So I know this is going a little bit slow, but that's okay. We're going to keep going. We're talking about assigning or subletting. Landlord cannot charge a fee for doing that, but they can approve and they cannot unreasonably withhold consent. Yeah. Consequences of an assignment, consequences of subletting, overholding a subtenant. Now, overholding right there tells me that it is a fixed term. Overholding means let's say you've got a year lease or a 6-month lease, some kind of fixed term lease. An overhold is when they stay past their allotted time. That's an overhold. So that tells me that it ends abruptly. It does not automatically convert to month or what's called a periodic tenancy. Rent payable to under a sublet, so somebody else. So a tenant shall not charge a subtenant more rent than is payable under the tenancy agreement. Basically, the tenant cannot make money off of the sublet. I bet that does happen though. Okay, so then it talks about additional provisions respecting mobile homes. I'm going to keep going. Landlord's responsibility. Okay, that was all for mobile homes. Okay, ending of tenancy. Inspection and ending of tenancy, because if you were a good landlord, you will have a condition inspection at the beginning of the tenancy, which is good. And if you don't, look, it says 2 opportunities for inspection. The landlord shall offer the tenant at least 2 reasonable opportunities for the inspection. And if it doesn't happen, then the landlord will note that they tried and leave it at that. So and you've got to use their approved form for the condition inspection, which is great. The landlord and the tenant must sign at the time of departure. So this is the end one. And you've got to give a copy of everything to the tenant, which is fine. Obligations. Let's see. Unless the landlord and tenant agree otherwise, the tenant shall vacate the rental unit by 5 p.m. on the day the tenancy ends. Something interesting happens in BC. The last day of the month, the tenant has to be out by 1 p.m., but the move-in doesn't happen until the next day on the 1st. This has been a problem in the past because if people are shuffling units, then we've got tenants who want to stay until the morning of the 1st because they can't get their new place until the 1st. And so what ends up happening is what I call a quick change. This is where the outgoing tenant and the incoming tenant basically high five at the door And it sounds like PEI is something similar because if you've got the end of the month, 5 p.m., and then your tenant doesn't move in until 1 p.m., it sounds like it's setting up for the exact same thing. Isn't that crazy? Okay, let's talk about returning that security deposit, 1 month's rent, plus interest. You've got 15 days after the tenancy ends or is assigned. The landlord shall either issue payment or make an application to the director claiming against the security deposit. Basically, if there was willful damage, the landlord has to make application, but you still have to justify it. You have to justify it to the director and you have to justify it to the outgoing tenant as well. Landlord may retain amount from security deposit. The may retain the amount from security deposit, the amount that the director has previously ordered the tenant to pay or remains unpaid at the end of tenancy. I wonder if that means that you can use unpaid rent paid on the security deposit. Not sure. That's a little, again, it can get a little confusing here. Like, and I'm just reading this, like, I don't have rentals in PEI, so I'm just looking at this sort of with fresh eyes, trying to make sure that it makes sense. And this one's a little more complicated than I anticipated, but that's okay. Okay, consequences of non-compliance. When a landlord does not comply with this section, the landlord shall not make a claim against the security deposit, and the tenant shall pay double the amount of the security deposit. Fun. How to repay the deposit. Landlord may retain, oh, here we go. Landlord may retain the security deposit where a tenant has not provided an address to the landlord in accordance with the last clause. Within 6 months after the tenancy, the landlord has made reasonable efforts to repay the security deposit. So you're trying to pay the security deposit back, but they've given either no forward address or you've given it the address of the rental unit itself and it doesn't get forwarded. It just sort of gets in this loop or it gets returned. Then the landlord either may keep the security deposit, this is after 6 months, of course, and the right to the tenant can to return the security deposit is extinguished. Basically, it's expired. They've tried for 6 months. Okay, abandonment. This is on the bingo card. Abandonment of the rental by the tenant. Where the tenant has abandoned the rental unit, the landlord may enter and take possession of the rental unit, meaning you can change the locks, you can take possession of whatever space it is, but what's defined as abandoned. A tenant is considered to have abandoned the rental unit only where a tenant has vacated the rental unit, meaning they're not there. The tenancy agreement is not terminated in accordance with the act or the tenancy agreement, and the rent is overdue, meaning they're not there, they haven't paid the rent, and the lease is still going on. Like they're still supposed to be paying and they're supposed to be living there. So you still have to post 24 hours notice of entry, basically to verify the status of abandonment. And the tenant is supposed to notify the landlord under the clause in this Residential Tenancy Act that the rental unit has not been abandoned. The landlord shall not enter the rental unit. Basically, if they're just, let's say something happened to a family member of the tenant and they just took off to go take care of the family member but didn't say anything. This can happen. This is real life scenarios. And if the tenant is not there and they forgot to pay rent, especially if it's like on one of the holidays that it's on the first, like famously, New Year's Day and Canada Day, both on the first, will almost always get forgotten rent. I will have typical offenders that I have to remind and say, hey, by the way, your rent is due because it's the first, and of course the banks are closed, so that's fun. Okay, let's get back into if a unit is abandoned. Tenant's personal property. A tenant is not entitled to leave the tenant's personal property in the rental unit after the tenancy agreement is terminated. However, when a tenant abandons or vacates a rental unit and leaves personal property on the residential property in the unit, the landlord shall either remove said personal property and immediately place it in safe storage, or store the personal property on the residential property in a safe manner, like move it to the basement or a shed or something else. But the whole idea here is that as soon as a unit is deemed abandoned, that landlord wants to recover the unit and get it re-rented, right? But if all that personal stuff is in the way from the previous tenant, they've got to do something with it. So this allows the landlord to do something, but you also have to inventory it. You're going to see that here in a second. You have to inventory it and you have to store it and you have to make reasonable efforts to reach out to that tenant and say, hey, I've got your stuff, but if they're in the hospital or if they're incarcerated, that also happens. They may not be coming back. They may not have the capability to come back. Okay, minimum storage period. A personal property of the tenant required to be stored shall be stored for not less than 1 month unless the tenant takes possession of the personal property before the applicable period has elapsed. So basically, the landlord's got to store it for 1 month. And then once the landlord has stored the unit or stored the personal property of the tenant, then what they're supposed to do is the landlord is supposed to provide an inventory of everything that's in storage and provide the director of that, the director of the residential tenancy branch here, provide the tenant with a copy of the inventory if the landlord can locate the tenant, say, here's all the stuff I have for you. So a landlord who stores a tenant's personal property may apply to the director without notice to the tenant for permission to dispose of the tenant's personal property. The director will then they will rule and authorize the landlord to dispose of personal property and on reasonable grounds, if they dispose of it, if the personal property has no monetary value, or the cost of removing, selling, or storing the personal property would be more than the proceeds of a sale, or the storage of the personal property would be unsanitary or safe, which is that can happen. The tenant may take possession of the personal property within 1 month, but they've got to pay whatever fees to reimburse the landlord, right? That's not for free. And then storage costs, and it goes on and on. I'm not going to keep going with this, but basically, if you've got a claim, if you're in this situation, you need to make sure you understand what's going on in PEI with this abandoned property thing, because this is really detailed. It can get really sticky, and there's likely other people that you can ask about this. They will help you, but you need to get more deep in the weeds on this. And this is not likely to happen. Like very often, this doesn't happen very often. It's happened to be one time in 15 years. Okay. Abandoned mobile home, notice to tenant. Okay, we're going to keep going here. Da, da, da. Let's see. Rent increases. Landlord shall not increase the rent except in accordance with this part. Okay. Um, Obligations of the landlord under this part run with the rental unit and not the tenant. This is interesting. Okay. So remember, when you sign the lease, you have to disclose what the previous tenant was paying. So if you increase the rent, you increase the rent of the unit, not on the tenant. That's very interesting. I've not seen that before at all. Wow. Okay, so timing of the rent increases. A landlord shall not impose a rent increase for at least 12 months after whichever the following applies. Basically, the first time that they've ever rented or once a year. They can't do it closer than once a year. Where a landlord increases the amount of rent payable, the landlord shall give tenant written notice of the increase, which is at least 3 weeks before the effective date of the increase where the rental unit is rented from week to week. So you got to give them 3 weeks notice, or at least 3 months if you're renting month to month. That makes sense. Okay. And that's what it is in BC as well. And that's what it is lots of other places is lots of notice. That's okay. Okay, landlord is not required to give notice under the section where the landlord makes an application to the director in accordance with section 50 for an additional rent increase. But a notice of rent increase shall be on the approved form signed by the landlord, state the effective date of the landlord, state the amount of the increase, state of the amount of the new rent payable when the increase becomes effective, and served on the tenant in a manner. In fact, I even go one step further. There's usually a rent increase calculator, and I'm assuming there is one for PEI. In fact, let's look right here because rent increase calculator, PEI. PEI rents. I wonder if there is one. I know there's one in BC, and what I do in BC is I do all the rental increase notices, and then I actually print the calculator from BC, and I include that with the rent increase. So I do all of that so that they can see it's not just me making it up. Okay, so this is peirentaloffice.ca. I've actually got this as one of the additional ones. I know I'm only on the first resource, but this is the one that's going to take the longest, and then we'll go through it. I don't see a rent calculator, but they're saying that the annual allowable rent increase cannot exceed 3%. Okay. No, wait a minute. The rental. Okay, so this was in. Oh, I'm misreading. The director of residential tenancy has the set the annual allowable rent increase effective January 1, 2026 at 2% on all rental units heated or unheated, including mobile home sites. But the Residential Tenancy Act, the cap on rent increases across the board in the act is 3% completely. But for 2026, you can only increase it 2%. Okay, I got it. I got it. Okay, so the one thing I would do different is I would do a calculator, but they don't seem to have a calculator, at least one that's not popping up on the search engines really quickly, but that's okay. Okay, a tenant may treat a rent increase notice as a notice of termination. That's fine. A tenant may elect to depart the unit completely, but they have to give effective notice. By doing that, okay, calculation of an allowable rent increase. Okay, we just saw how they do it. The director sets the amount that you can. Guideline for the calendar year shall not exceed 3%. We just saw that maximum percent in rent increase per year is 3%. And oh, look at this. The guideline for 2023 calendar, it was 0. You could not raise rents at all in PEI in 2023. Interesting. Landlord shall give written notice for the approved tenant making a request for an additional increase. So landlords can go for an additional increase. And it looks like there are some factors on how they can do it. Basically, rent history, change in operation and capital expenditures, expectation of the landlord to have a reasonable return on the capital investment. Basically, the tenant's going to get more for their money, and so they're making application to the director saying, look, I'd like more rent because I'm doing all these amazing and fantastic improvements on the property. They're going to get a better value. The only problem with that is that the tenant may not be able to afford the new unit, even though the amenities are going to be spectacular. They will probably leave. They might leave. That's always an option, right? Okay. Increases. No, director's powers. Okay, ending a tenancy, security of tenure. I'm not sure I know what that means. A tenancy shall be terminated only in accordance with this act. Okay, fair enough. Let's see. Deemed where no notice. Okay, so here we go. Where a tenancy agreement ends on a specific date and does not include an option to renew, and the landlord has not terminated the agreement, the lease agreement, the landlord and the tenant are deemed to automatically renew the tenancy on that date as a monthly tenancy. So it does auto convert, but that's interesting because they've used the term holdover previously. So it implies that it ends abruptly. I guess the landlord, okay, I guess that would make sense. The landlord or the tenant must say, look, I'm going to leave at the end of the fixed term, but they have to give proper notice that they're not going to renew. And if they don't say that, if they don't actually say that, then this clause says, okay, if you haven't actually given your tenant notice and saying you're going to renew or not going to renew, then it automatically renews month to month. Okay, that makes sense, I guess. Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Effective date too early. Tenants notice. Notice for a weekly tenancy. Okay, notice for monthly or other periodic tenancy this is ending the tenancy. A tenant may end a month-to-month or periodic tenancy by giving the landlord a notice termination effective date that is not earlier than 1 month after the date the landlord receives the notice and is the day before the end the rent is payable under that tenancy agreement. Yeah. So basically it's one full calendar month. So if it's October 31st, then they have to give notice that they're going to depart November 30th, right? Something like that. And let's see, for fixed term tenancy, a tenant may end a fixed term tenancy by giving the landlord notice of termination effective on that date. And it's the same thing. It looks like it's still proper notice is one full calendar month. Okay, so then it talks about ways that tenants can end the tenancy due to safety issues. And this is family violence, abuse. This is so sad that when I see this in here, because I have lived such a sheltered life that I don't see this kind of thing. I've not been privy to this kind of thing, but there are a lot of people who have. Breaks my heart. I'm actually talking with a former tenant who is interested in one of our rental units and is asking if we have anywhere for her and her son to go. And I'm just going, oh, this breaks my heart. But this is part of it, and this is PEI's guidelines for all of this, the act here. So it talks about the different notice, if people are fleeing, what is it all about, confidentiality. Yeah. Advertising. Let's see. Yeah, it's just talking about all of these different options. I'm on page 37 going into 38. This is talking about all of the different ways and things for a tenant to give notice for safety. Yeah, just in case. Wow. Okay. Landlord's notice of non-payment of rent. Landlord may end tenancy if rent is unpaid after the day it was due by giving notice and termination effect on the day that is not earlier than 20 days after the tenant receives the notice. So basically, rent may end a tenancy if the rent is unpaid after the day it is due. So if rent is due on the first and it's not due on the first, they can give notice on the second that they have 20 days by giving notice of termination effective not earlier than 20 days. So they have 20 days basically to get out. Pay or get out, I guess. Wow. Oh, here we go. So here it is. Tenant may dispute the notice or pay the unpaid rent within 10 days of receiving notice of termination under this section. The tenant may pay the overdue rent or dispute the notice of termination. So basically, if they don't pay the rent, they have 10 days to pay or 20 days basically to get out. 10 to pay and 20 to get out. BC, it's a little different. It's faster. It's a faster way to do it, but wow. Hmm. Interesting. Unpaid utilities, notice for cause. Basically, there's too many people living in it. You've got disturbance, engaged in illegal activities, and oh, there's a bunch more. Wow. Giving false information. Yep. Tenant knowingly gives false information about the residential property to a prospective tenant. They're trying to sabotage re-renting it. That's terrible. The exception of family violence, again, it's in here. Period notice, form of notice. Landlord may not provide. Yeah, I'm just looking through this as we go through condominiums, affidavit. Okay, as we go through this, talks about notice given in bad faith. Everybody's got to play in good faith. It just karma's a bitch. It'll get after you. Okay. Right of first refusal. Okay, this is interesting. And the whole thing, I have a feeling as we get into this is going to be really interesting because the whole notion that a rent amount goes with the unit, not the tenant, is so different for me because in all of my units, the rent was with the tenant. So this might be interesting. Um, Oh, here we go. So this is okay, here's the scenario. It's not about the rent going with the unit, but what it is, it says a tenant who receives notice of termination under of tenancy under whatever clause has and may exercise in accordance with this section a first right of refusal to occupy the rental unit as a tenant when the repairs or renovations are completed. Meaning, so if they get displaced because of a renovation or a major repair, then they get the first chance to get back in that unit. They don't have to, but they can. Right to compensation. Oh my. Overholding tenants. There's that that term again, overhold. Proceeding, resolving disputes, confidentiality. Okay. In all of this, if you get into a dispute and you have to do something before the director, you have to give proper notice. You have to give proper service to the tenants, and you have to make sure you're counting your days. Your days are really critical in all of these. If you're off by one day, it can negate the entire thing and you have to start over. So typically what I do is I give an extra day just to make sure that I've got all my days. So I go, this, except I won't give them notice on the second, I'll give them notice on the third, and then I'll give them an extra day on the back end to just to make sure that we've got enough notice. Okay, hearing procedure. Director's decisions. Okay, we're nearing the end of this. And I know that there are some template forms that are a part of this. And I don't think they're in this document though. So let's go to the next document. Okay. Yeah, we're at the end of this one. Okay, so the next one is peirentaloffice.ca. This talks about news and notices. This one is princeedwardisland.ca. So statutes and regulations. I actually threw this one in because it was so interesting. Every single act that is of part of PEI, 443 of them are in here. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff in here. So not just with housing. So you might, if you're interested at all and you've got rentals in PEI, you might just dig into this because there's all kinds of interesting stuff here. And very likely there is the most updated stuff is in this one. So make sure you're looking at that if you are interested. So the PEI Residential Tenancy Act was proclaimed. It actually was originally written, I think, 30 years ago. It was a long time ago, and they redid the Tenancy Act that we just went through. They redid it in 2022, and so this is a article from 2023 that was talking about all the differences in the old version of the Tenancy Act versus the new version. And so there's a bunch of stuff in here and immediate contact. General inquiries, here's one of your helping things. Like if you need help, PEI isn't a very big place. You start calling people or emailing people, which so their phone number for Prince Edward Island, 1-877-368-5770, or you can email them at housing@gov.pe.ca. And if you've got a question at all, just call or email someone and say, here's my question. I don't understand what I need to do. Direct me. And they will, because that's the reality is that these people are designed to help. That's good. Now, this is really interesting. There is something, I'm going to flip back to the first um, source that I just went through the whole thing, right? This is the Residential Tenancy Act of PEI. And then the fourth one is Residential Tenancy Regulations, which was the one that was repealed. This is what was really interesting. Yeah, former act. So it's only 7 pages and it just defines a few things, but the majority of the former act was repealed. It was replaced with the Tenancy Act. Pretty cool. Interesting. Okay, next one. This is a CBC article that I found. This was from May of 2024 about the reaction of PEI Residential Tenancy Act for both, it says both tenants and landlords want changes. And so this is about the housing minister talking about how effective the new act is in housing and tenancy. And so I found this interesting. I wanted to just give you some concept. Now, this is over a year old, right? I'm recording this in late 2025. But it's kind of interesting to see the progression of this, especially if you have rentals in PEI. And so it's talking about this. And then the other thing that you can do, or I might even do as we go through, is I'll reach out to whoever wrote the article and say, hey, have you had any updates on this type of thing? So we haven't quite gone to that yet. I want to get through all the locations first before I start doing that. But that's where we're at. So I'm going to stop screen sharing at the moment. I'm going to stop sharing. Am I not sharing anymore? I think I'm stopped sharing. Oh, I've stopped sharing. No, I still am sharing. Stop sharing. Stop share. Here we go. Stop share. Okay, got it. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my bingo card. I know we've gone a little bit late on this, but I really wanted to get into the PEI stuff because it's relatively new. A lot of these other acts that I've gone through are decades old and then they get updated every once in a while, but it seems like the PEI Act is sort of fresh out of proclamation from 2 years ago. I mean, it's interesting how this is all gone through. But let's go through my bingo card here because there are some things that nobody said anything about in the act. Tenant application fee. They said, nope, you cannot charge them an application fee at all. Grace period for late rent without penalty. Now, here's the kicker. They didn't say grace penalty, but they said you can give notice of your intent to end tenancy because of non-payment of rent, and the tenant has 10 days to pay or 20 days to get out. Now you tell me, is that a grace period or is that just flirting with an eviction? I mean, that's a lot of stress. But there was also no discussion at all about a late fee. A late fee, right? So typically it's a percentage of the rent or it's a flat amount or a maximum amount that can be charged. And it's usually either within, again, this grace period comes in saying, is there a grace period at all? Sometimes it's 2, 3, 5 days, whatever it is. And then there's a late fee. Or maybe it's a percentage of the late fee that you would pay on the expenses of that unit. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can see, but I didn't see a grace period and I didn't see a late fee at all. Security deposit, yes, 1 month's rent, and you've got to have it in a financial institution at PEI. And if you have more than three rentals, three or more rentals, so three or more, you have to have it in a trust account just for security deposits, and it must be interest bearing. So it's in a separate account. I mean, all the security deposits I have on both sides of the border are separate accounts. It does talk about lease wording and details. Is there an emergency contact required for the tenant? Nothing from PEI requires landlords to have a emergency contact for the tenant, but that's always best practices, especially if the unit is abandoned or the tenant is incapacitated or dies or is imprisoned. And so those are always best practices. So please make it a habit that you have an emergency contact somewhere for your tenants, even, as a part of your January 1, and just say, hey, we want to get emergency contacts for everyone just in case something happens to you. Pets and animals. It only talked about service animals. It did not talk about pets. It did not talk about a pet deposit or pet rent. Service animals are a different thing. They are not pets. But there was nothing said about pet anything, except the only thing I would argue is that it said that you cannot charge anything more than 1 month's rent for the deposit, which I would argue that would include any pet deposit, right? Delivery of a signed lease required. Yes, 10 days. Condition inspection required at move-in. Yes. Standard warning letters or wording of said warning letters. No, there doesn't seem to be any templates or forms, not that I found. They might be there, but I didn't find them. How often can rent be increased? Once a year or once a year after the initial rent. And remember, in PEI, the rent increase goes with the unit, not the tenant. That's super different. Proper notice of a rent increase. Typically, it's if you're renting weekly, it's 3 weeks notice. If you're renting monthly or there's a fixed term, it's got to be 3 months. How much can rent increase? Maximum of 3% for the year, but the director sets the rate. Renter's insurance. Nothing was mentioned about renter's insurance at all. Is abuse of access defined? Yes, landlord access is defined for sure. Landlord retaliation, is that defined? So it doesn't say anything specifically about landlord retaliation. It does talk about decrease of services and an accompanying rent decrease, but it does not talk about landlord retaliation specifically in the PEI Residential Tenancy Act. So that's interesting. By the way, if you're wondering what landlord retaliation is if a tenant turns in a landlord because of a code or habitability issue, or they form a tenant union, then and the landlord wants to do some kind of retaliation against the tenant, so they can either try to evict them, increase the rent, or decrease the services. And typically it's within some kind of period after either the code enforcement or the union creation has happened. It's usually 3 or 6 months or some time frame saying, look, within this time frame, unless there is due cause, like you can prove that this person is doing something illegal or there's some kind of mischief going on, you cannot evict them, increase the rent, or decrease the services for any reason. That's considered landlord retaliation. Or there might not be any timeline at all. It might just be forever until the end of the tenancy. You're not allowed to do that. So it's really interesting. End of the fixed lease. Is it abrupt? We've talked about this because they use the word overhold, but it does auto convert to periodic if the landlord doesn't give proper notice to the tenant. Condition inspection at the time of move out. Yes. Return of deposit. Timing, yes. Within 15 days, you have to return the deposit, or you've got to make an application to the director that you want to deduct. Can you use the deposit as last month's rent? Yes or no? We didn't see anything about it. However, if the tenant skips out, I guess the landlord could make application to the director and say, this person didn't pay their last month's rent and they're leaving. I'd like to take their deposit and use it for unpaid rent, and let the director decide. I have no idea if you'd get it back or not. How long can you give notice of eviction of non-payment rent? How long until you can give notice of eviction due to non-payment of rent or utilities? Well, it looks like 24 hours. If they don't pay the rent when it's due, it's literally the next day you can give notice. That they have 10 days to pay and 20 days to get out. How long until you can give notice of eviction due to mischief? I did not look. We kind of blew through that because of the domestic violence one. I didn't look at it, but I would imagine it's somewhere around 30 or 60 days. It's probably 30 days, but I don't, you know what? Now that's going to bother me. Shoot. Just a minute. Let's go back to the Residential Tenancy Act and let's look. Let's look at what the eviction timing is. Let's see. Ending of a tenancy. Ending a tenancy due to illness, long-term care, order of commission, landlord's notice for cause. Here we go. So, okay, so you can give notice for cause. Landlord can give notice for cause if they do not pay the security deposit within 10 days of the date required. The tenant is repeatedly late in paying rent, but as a landlord, you're my waggling finger, you've got to make sure that you are taking note and have a record of when they are paying rent. So if it's repeatedly paying rent, you have to be able to prove that. If there's an unreasonable number of occupants in the unit, okay, so, but we're trying to figure out how long that you can do this. Okay, so here it is. It says a notice of termination under this section shall end the tenancy effective on the date that is not earlier than 1 month after the date the notice is served, or the notice is received the day before. Okay, so yeah, so it's basically 1 month, but it's one full calendar month, right? So if you're going to give them notice of termination of tenancy due to mischief, then you have to give them notice, but you have to also back out the days of service. So if you want to evict someone on October 31st, but PEI considers them served after 3 days, then you have to serve them on or before this, September 26th or September 27th. Remember, days count in this. Days count. So make sure you're paying attention. Okay, so that answers the question. Let me make sure before we move on here. How long until you can get possession of a unit? That one's easy. Basically, the director will tell you when you can get your possession back. And then abandoned items. We've talked about this. Talked about the administrative inventory, storage, disposition instructions. It didn't talk about a value, but it did say that you have to store the items for 1 month and then make reasonable communication to try to get the tenant to let them know that you have their stuff. Okay, that concludes the bingo card. PEI got a good bunch of them, but there were some other ones that they didn't get at all. But that's not surprising. I have yet to see a location that hits every single one of my bingo card, which is fine. That's what the whole thing is for. Okay, let's wind down here. Each of my location-specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way. As I mentioned, 4 questions that we answered. What are the basics of that province governing document? What are the nuances of that location? What is the different items that stand out? What are some guidance about abandoned items left behind by the tenant? And then for where to get help in your local real estate, state or province. Where do you get help in PEI? Any of the hyperlinks that I have in the show notes here, every single one of them at the very bottom will have phone numbers, emails, all kinds of contact information to get you where you need to go, get you started. And then the format is the exact same. So if you end up looking elsewhere geographically for rental units, you can go into the library. All of these location-specific podcasts are set up in the exact same way. One more time, this location-specific location-specific episode is not all-inclusive. You've got to do your own research. Even if I got every single point perfectly right, which I'm sure I didn't, but even if I did, 10 minutes after I am done recording, it could change, and it very will change. So here's your call to action. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you are either living in PEI, thinking about real estate, or you have rentals in PEI. So here's what you can do to educate yourself further. The first thing you can do is read the Prince Edward Island Residential Tenancy Act, which is a hyperlink in this show. So how do you find all of that? Again, it's right there in your show notes. If you're listening to this on your phone or on YouTube, you can go right in there and read all those different resources. The second thing you can do is you can get in the same room as other landlords in PEI. Get in the same room, whether you're in a Zoom room or you're in a physical room with them, like a local meetup. There are meetups. So make sure you're looking out where the landlords in PEI are gathering and then go there. It's actually quite simple. So they're asking same questions. They've got experiences. If you're wanting to ask them questions and learn, which I bet you are if you're listening to this podcast, make sure you are getting in the room with PEI landlords. I hope you enjoyed today's show about the province of Canada, PEI, Prince Edward Island. Don't forget to subscribe for more expert advice and rental stories from across the globe. We're recording this episode today from British Columbia, north of Vancouver, in a remote logging camp, sitting on the boat while the guys go elk hunting. Isn't that crazy? I am legitimately sitting here in a remote area recording podcasts. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next episode live right now in the library, episode 193 about Washington, D.C. I'll see you there.